Welcome, gamers and game curious. I'm Spike Murphy Rose, your host for RPG Obsession, the podcast where passion meets inspiration. Today we're speaking with writer, artist, and game designer Jennell Jaquays. If you've heard the term Jaquays in your dungeon, that's because of her. Her towering body of work in both tabletop RPGs and the video game industry stretches back to the earliest days of both. And today we're going to be speaking with her about her passion for gaming, her design philosophy, and how you can apply that in your own game at home. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Let's start at the beginning. So, Jennell, you have been involved in gaming in many different ways since the late 70s. Now, the story I have heard was that you were introduced to gaming through the Space Gamer, old magazine from, I think it was Metagaming Concepts that was putting it out at the time.
At the time, they were called Metagaming Concepts. That was the fall of 1975.
Wow. I'm not going to say how long ago that was because both of us will then be thinking about that number. But, and so I remember it was I heard your brother had been reading some of the reviews or ads for Dungeons and Dragons to you from the Space Gamer, and that was what got you hooked, right? When you were working a radio show back in college, I think.
Yep.
But it wasn't D&D that you ended up getting to play first as an RPG, correct?
Right. We didn't get to play. What showed up first was the Greyhawk manual.
Oh.
Which, it was kind of, it gave us a flavor of what D&D would be like.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual rule books and chainmail, which we thought we needed to have, were all back ordered. So my brother got a copy of Tunnels and Trolls. I mean, we're talking the mimeographed in a yellow paper cover version of Tunnels and Trolls. I think it was this is like second edition maybe, or close to first real edition. So he actually ran a dungeon for me over my college break. He was in high school at the time. And that was my first role-playing game experience.
Yeah, and it's Tunnels and Trolls was also my first RPG experience. So you were playing your brother ran you through Tunnels and Trolls, and then when you eventually got a hold of the D&D books, did you hop into Greyhawk, or were you doing homebrew stuff immediately, or
we did nothing but homebrew. When I say Greyhawk, I'm talking the half-size brown covered rule book, the leatherette style rule book. So it really was just a rules supplement. There was no real world attached to it.
Yeah.
So we just started using the 5 D&D handbooks that we could get our hands on at the time. There were 4. The three original rules in the box, and then Greyhawk, and that was our sum total of knowledge of what was D&D for a while until I think Blackmore and the one that came after that.
I don't remember what was after Blackmore, but
it was the one with the nude girl on the cover that was so shocking to me at my Christian college.
Yeah, well, that's D&D continued to shock, and for a long time, it's interesting to see how accepted and mainstream it is now, and how much persecution it faced for a lot of different reasons early on, whether it was for like imagery like that, or like in, was it Tower of the Silver Princess?
Palace of the Silver Princess?
Yeah.
And I think that was more internal than anything else.
Yeah. So that actually does get to something that I'd really been curious about, because Gary, of course, and speaking of Greyhawk as well, like he definitely had his approach, his philosophy about how people should be playing the game and approaching the game, and not wanting to give too much information. The idea was give you the very basic building blocks, almost like an open Minecraft world, to put it in modern terms. Like, here's where the important supplies are found in the area. Here's what troop numbers are like. Here's what the main trade routes and sea routes are, and then you figure out what all the details and the story that's going to go in there is. But he also was much more focused on just the raw mechanics. And I mean, I think we all saw with Dave Arneson kind of represented the opposite approach, where for him it was much more about the story and the role play. And
Hmm.
one of the things that's been continually cited about your work is how, in many ways, you kind of combine both of those philosophies. Designing using the elements of the game, those core components of the game, to try and guide and direct. To support, I should say, to try and support story, to be able to tell story just from their presence. And
And that's actually, it's just an example of good writing, is that you set a scene and the scene tells the story. I mean, that's like in a play, in a movie. Um, that's
mhm,
why set dressing in movies is so important, because it sets the scene. It reveals information about what's going on without saying a word. It's just you build. Uh, Fiction is built off of characters,
mhm,
but in game settings, you don't have um, protagonists. I guess the best way to say it is that you've written a story of sorts. Actually, you've written a setting with no protagonist.
right. And well, and actually, so I remember I was listening to an earlier interview that you had done where you were talking about some of the. It was actually updating one of your old modules for 5e, or a different module for 5e or something, but
Mm-hmm.
how it had what you had been doing, it turned into a block of text, or the old one had been, and you wanted to break that up more and make it less complicated. I think it had to do with a complicated illusion or something like that. But
Oh
you
yeah,
realized that
yeah,
it was becoming something that was happening to the players, that they were viewing a story rather than participating in it.
right.
And that gets me to thinking about how much you did with both your early work in, say, like Caverns of Thracia and the Dark Tower, but even going to, I mean, like, you designed a lot of you did level design when you were with ID, correct?
Yeah, that was my job. Was level
Yeah,
design.
for like Quake 2, for major games that helped shape the FPS genre, and talk about a game medium where you really don't have that opportunity to deliver the box text to the players. Everything about
Right.
whatever story is going to be there, you have to tell them through visual elements, through sound, through just the way things are laid out, and the impression that gives them. So I guess I'm curious how that developed and that approach. Like, is that something that started, or was that like, was your brother not describing things enough for you when he was running Tunnels and Trolls?
Well, he only ran one adventure for me, and then I went on a trip to Europe. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't play D&D for a while. But the whole is I just like telling stories from, I guess, that you could experience with multiple sensations. And I got known for, I guess, called designing specials into my work, so that everything had kind of a special feeling to it. Well, I took all my dungeon rooms from my own adventures and put them all in one map, sort of thing, so that they were all the unusual,
hmm
weird things. That's the best way to put it.
Right, like, your greatest hits from your home game.
Yes, and that's a good way to put it. They were my greatest hits from my home game. And that was pretty much how I designed. And I got hired in at ID because of my experience with designing D&D games. Before that time, I had never even heard of Quake. Quake came out in '96. I'd never even heard of it. I'd heard of their game Doom, but not Quake.
hmm
So when I interviewed with them and was learning the tools, it was this whole idea of trying to push the tool beyond its limits to create spaces that, for me, told stories.
Yeah. Well, and it strikes me that that's something that you were doing even early on with D&D. Like you got this
Yes.
raw set of rules and you figured out how to turn it into these stories. And I'm sure, I mean, because you were submitting not just art but writing and coming up with stuff very early on, eventually in like Dragon Magazine and official TSR publications, but even earlier in, oh my god, the Dungeoneer. That was it.
Yeah. Yeah. We'd only been playing the game for maybe a couple months when we decided that there wasn't enough stuff out there for people to play. And I think I may have been inspired by Dave Arneson's Temple of the Frog,
A
but
great adventure.
which, the original one in the Blackmore rulebook.
Mm-hmm.
So which that inspired me. So why not include a completely worked out adventure in um, every magazine, and that became what we did. And it just seemed the natural thing to do to me.
Well, right, and that seems natural to all of us now, but I think it's hard to appreciate how almost groundbreaking that was back at the time, because like you had the philosophy coming down from the top from Gary Gygax, who's actively saying I made RPGs, that it's basically all about the mechanics, it's all about the tactical side of things. That it, why, like, don't ask me to like do your work for you and make a game world or make like you figure it out. And there's
And I think that was actually a fair thing to do, because there was this. I guess the assumption is that everyone who played the game would be as creative as the people who wrote the rules. And
right,
what I think we found over time is that, yeah, we're pretty creative people, but we don't always have time to do the whole big thing, and then we don't have necessarily the same experience as writers or designers to create those engaging spaces that maybe a professional could.
right. And that's something that, and I respect that too, that where that philosophy was coming from, and I see the merit in it. Like I'm actually running a game right now using the original, not the original Greyhawk release, but the Greyhawk Gazetteer, and
Uh-huh.
just trying to base it not off of everything that came later, but just off of what Gary had intended there, because I saw that the elegance in that, and how it's meant to be encouraging. It's meant to be the bird leaving the nest and flying for the first time. But again, it comes with that assumption that everyone is going to want to approach the game, put in the same amount of effort that Gary and Tim Cast and Dave Arneson and all those other guys, everyone there was feeling and putting in at the time. And we're all at different places. We all have different numbers of spoons that we can give. Not everyone can design amazing adventures, or campaigns or mechanics.
Hmm.
I know for me, that attitude of that kind of like, well, you should be meeting this minimum standard. I definitely felt that early on, like even as a kid, and I didn't realize what kind of gatekeeping that was until I got older, and how much I had kind of inherited that culture without even knowing it. And
Well,
we
you say
go on.
by the time you got into gaming, AD&D was already established, and AD&D was Gary Gygax telling everyone how to play D&D, because that became the tournament rules. So everyone would be standardized to play it one particular way for like
Hmm.
tournament gameplay.
It's interesting because you see the goals that were there for, like, if you can turn something into a tournament, that gives you more opportunities for merchandising, for monetizing it, for getting more money off of the same amount of content essentially. and
Right.
they always had those aspirations for D&D, and we've seen that morph with how throughout like the end of third edition and then all of like fourth edition and still in fifth edition they've been wanting to turn D&D into a almost digital subscription model, and they've or into a digital subscription model. They openly said so at
Hmm.
Gen Con back in 2010. But they haven't been able to get all the way there yet. But there's always been that they've still been striving to find that way to unlock some kind of secret level of monetization that at least, well, I mean, it's a lot more profitable than it's ever been in the past. There's definitely
Right.
for sure.
That is a for sure. Yeah, I grew up when you say I came into it when it was literally a hobby job industry.
Hmm.
I came back to it when it was a, we'll call it a big business. I guess that's the best way to describe it. When TSR had been in business as a publishing entity for almost 20 years. Yeah, by
Wow.
the time I came back, it was almost 20 years. By the time I left, it was 25. And they were they had gone from being a hobby that was trying to become a business to a business that couldn't understand why it was failing.
Hmm. It's unfortunate because almost at that same period, there's so much great talent that came through TSR and made a lot of great content there and went on to make a lot of great content later. And there, it's hard to see any project from that time, especially when I think when you're getting to like the late '90s of TSR, when things were really starting to fall apart for them again. There was
Which is
just
I was yeah, that's where I was with them at that time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Birthright and Dragon Dice, correct?
Yep.
And I know Lester Smith still thinks Dragon Dice could make a comeback one day. Uh,
Well, it actually continues. They sold they sold the license to a company called SFR, and SFR continues to produce Dragon Dice.
oh, I actually was not aware. Well, shame on me for not doing my research well
Oh
enough. That's
yeah,
great.
that's like 20 years ago they did this. Yeah,
Okay, wow.
the company is called SFR, and they bought the license from Wizards of the Coast, and they have been keeping the game alive and have actually issued at least, well, they've issued I think one new set of dice that we had in production when or that I had designed the art for when I was at TSR. They changed the art a bit, but
Hmm.
they're keeping it going. They're doing small new. They're what are we doing? Reissuing some of the older packs because they're essentially remanufactured. They're having the dice made again,
Yeah.
and in some cases they've made a few new molds because mold making is freaking expensive.
Yeah, yeah. It's more accessible than it was in the past, but it's definitely not cheap, especially when you're talking about like the professional quality ones that you need for doing any kind of like mass production.
Well, the whole thing with Dragon Dice was figuring out first a system of how to design them to because there were some very specific specifications for
Hmm.
how you had to make them, design the content. And so figuring that out and then designing within that scope and also establishing a style,
Hmm.
which was all part of what that's one of my my major contribution I think to the whole thing was establishing the style.
Well, and again, I think that speaks to that skill set that you seem to have repeatedly drawn upon in so many different careers or industries throughout your life, is that ability to be able to conceptualize what is the experience going to be for the end user, for the
Hmm.
player in this case, and looking at all the different ways that you can impact that, being able to
Hmm.
take that holistic view of it, which again, I think shows in the level design that you've done, in the way that you find ways to tell stories in any way that you can. I'm
Yeah.
curious, because early on in D&D, there was also the so-called Hickman Revolution, which was really just Laura and Tracy putting out the types of adventures that they like to play. And, the kind of, and a couple of speeches that they had given at, some cons and stuff like that. But it was pretty straightforward. It seems sensible to us now, is basically that characters should be motivated by more than just gold and killing things, and there should be some kind of overall story that's linking things together and creating a sense of progress. And was that something that you were aware of, or that was ever brought up to you back, like, during that period, during the early 80s, when you were working on a lot of different gaming projects? Or,
No, no. The idea of using the game to tell, basically to tell the Dungeon Master story, I guess I will say that's it's probably why the game stumbled in the 90s. If we want to call it the Hickman Revolution, I'm not familiar with it in that terms, but the idea that you're telling the DM's story, or in this case, or the adventure writer's story, I think is a failing. I guess that's the best way I can say it. It's a failing because for me, the whole idea behind game adventures is they are sandboxes.
mm,
They're not meant for the players to reach a specific outcome, because that takes agency away from them. What you want to do is to create a setting that could become, that they become, it's that the setting basically is telling the player's own story.
right,
It's the way they tell their own story.
right.
And making this is how it has to play type of situation for that story, it makes it the DM's game instead of it being a game about the players.
Right. And that's so I think an example of that we can, like, clearly see in the kind of 90s era of TSR was the pure bloat of, like, Forgotten Realms lore. I love the Forgotten Realms. Ed Greenwood and Eric Boyd are friends. Uh there was a ton of content for that. And it was the novels and all the adventures and all the setting lore, which is, like, super interesting when you're the DM and you're finding out about all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But exactly, it created this sense of, like, well, this is how things go. And I know that the complaint I always heard about the Forgotten Realms was that people playing in it didn't feel important.
I can see I can see that point of view. The example I would have gone with from the point what I was making was Dragonlance.
Oh, yeah.
Dragonlance was the adventures were all about telling the story of those novels,
Mm-hmm.
with
And
the players acting out the roles of like story characters.
yeah, I had those because, Dragonlance. Of course, my friends and I were super into it, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was something that struck me as odd about the modules, and always had a strange feeling to it, because you felt like, well, there's the way the story is supposed to go. I've been running a Star Wars campaign for a while now, and that's definitely something I struggle with all the time in GMing. That is, I feel, even though my players don't care about it, I still feel like, well, there's the canon, there's the lore. Like, if I'm doing something different than that or contradicting that, then somehow what I'm doing isn't legitimate.
Yeah.
And
No, I'll come back and talk. Say, yeah, you're feeling that as a player in the Forgotten Realms, you're not a mover and shaker. I think that's true too.
mhm,
Having designed I wrote the Savage North for the Realms very early on in the
mhm,
whole. It was like the fifth Realms product. I actually kind of stepped on Ed's toes in a few places, because he had put in these Mary Sue characters that had been either player characters in his campaign or maybe even his player characters, and I kind of killed them. And
yeah,
I think Ed kind of came back, because they were very powerful. They were well-known characters, but I presented them as antagonists, not heroes. They weren't bad, they weren't hadn't gone evil, they'd gone mad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
So,
that can be a matter of perspective in a lot of
mhm.
cases, but that's always the issue with a shared world like the Realms. And I know even now Ed still struggles with that. Every interview he gives, there's always a lot of questions he gets asked where it's like, oh well, NDA, I can't talk about that. Even though I doubt
Yeah,
anyone at Wizards of the Coast cares.
yeah. I think Ed is he's a great guy. I've met him, talked to him, worked with him in the past. Um, but he is kind of the caretaker of the realms still, and
Yes.
it is still, it's still his campaign. When we were working on when I worked on Savage Frontier, what the designers at TSR provided me with were literally photocopies made from pasted up, that were made from paste ups
Mm-hmm.
that were clippings out of copies of Ed's notes,
Uh-huh.
all pasted together. So these little strips of paper that were glued down to a master sheet and photocopied because it had to do with the Savage Frontier.
I remember Ed talking about like making some of those too. I think because when dealing with Jeff Grubb, and they were like, "Hey, we want all the stuff together on this," and he would just physically glue or tape it together.
And
Uh,
that's how it worked. Yep.
yeah, but but definitely, Emily. I think it's a very different approach to world building. Like Ed is, he's always focused on stories and there being a story
Hmm.
everywhere. And I think that's like the magic that he presents in the realms is that like there's always detail, there's always that nuance there to interact with. But again, it becomes overwhelming when there's the giant meta story that's going on with that. And certainly Dragonlance suffered from the same thing. And I know that even Tracy and Laura Hickman, when they were talking about having the DM telling a story through the game, it was meant to resolve over 1 or 2 sessions. Basically telling the story of the adventure, not making everybody play through your novel. Though
Hmm.
that does remind me of an interesting tidbit that touches on this because you're friends, or you used to be friends with Michael Stackpole, correct?
Oh, still am. I'm still friends with Mike.
Oh,
Yeah.
fantastic! Because I think he's a wonderful person, and I love his work. But because he's also been involved in the gaming scene for a long time, but I think he the one that was at Coleco that
Yeah.
invited you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
and the reason I
We.
was thinking about this is because he wrote the Rogue Squadron series for the Star Wars novels, which were the first like novels that didn't star the main Star Wars characters. So he was having to
Hmm.
literally deal with this with like writing a story that wasn't just the one giant story of Star Wars, but somebody else's. Is that something
Yes.
he I guess tell me more about knowing him, and do you guys game together? Whether video games or
Um.
RPGs.
To be honest, no. What happened was I met Mike at a game convention in Michigan in the fall of 1980, and Rick Loomis introduced us. He said, "Hey, you should meet Mike. He's up here at the convention with me." So I met Mike. We talked. We chatted. It was an acquaintance level thing. And then that was it. We went our separate ways. Well, he called me back a couple weeks later and said, "Hey, I'm working at Coleco right now as a contractor. They need another designer. Are you available and interested?" And at the time, I was having trouble making rent, so I was available and interested. I just finished a huge, huge project for Chaosium Games, and it, I was, looking for my next thing that would, help me make my computer payments and my rent payments.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went and interviewed with Coleco, and they hired me that day. In fact, they were surprised when I needed to go home to collect my things to come back and work for 3 months.
Yeah, and
And
that
then
Oh, go on, go on.
Oh, I say, and then I came back, and Mike and I eventually shared an apartment for about 2 months, and then it came to near the end of the contract, and Coleco offered us both jobs as full-time jobs as designers at the company. And Mike said, no, that's not my goal. That's not where I want to go with my life.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back to Arizona, and his goal was to become famous novelist. And I think he did that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he became a best-selling novelist. And I was looking for some stability at the time, so I
Mm-hmm.
took the job.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me that again, it continues that thread of designing that experience of designing
Hmm.
designing, I guess, a sandbox where stories can happen,
Hmm.
not necessarily telling the story to people. You're letting people discovering story rather than telling
Right.
story.
You have them encounter the story, and then they decide how they're going to interact with it.
Yeah, that's
Whether it's, I mean, they could decide. They could encounter the story that needed heroes, and they could decide to be the villains.
hmm yeah, you want to have that freedom in there for your players. Or I guess that's something that I think. I know not everybody subscribes to that school of thought, of course, but I do like the idea of taking a holistic approach to the player's experience.
I think it's kind of the difference between naming your monster something. Let's say your big bad, something serious and threatening sounding, and or calling them, Bob the monster.
hmm
The same sort of idea is that you gave thought, you put some of your energy into creating a tone, and that seems to be what you're saying, is that you're trying to focus on creating an overall tone for what you're presenting, and not having things that break the players out of it.
Right. And I know for me, part of my journey as a gamer, both as a player and a GM, has been learning those ways beyond just, honestly, beyond just talking, beyond just
Hmm.
taking up that space to express either a character or to express story that I'm trying to convey as a DM, and learning how to edit that and learning where to put that effort into. Something that I, kind of remind myself a lot is that you need to own your experience. And that means you take responsibility for and do what you can with the elements that you can control about your experience in a game. And you try to let go of those things that you can't control, like expecting your players to all care about the game to the same degree that you do in the same way and be willing to put in the same amount of outside effort into the game.
Hmm.
I can't control that. And that, I mean, that touches on something that's been like a big factor in gaming for since its inception, really, is that there's always been this kind of attitude of gatekeeping. And
Hmm.
it takes a lot of forms, and it's been ugly at a variety in a variety of different ways and to a variety of different people over the years. But is that something that early on that there was some awareness of in your circles? Is that something that felt like it was there in kind of gaming society as a whole, or did that feel like that was something more external, like, well, that's how the guys in the Midwest do things?
Uh, I know that one of my first experiences with that level of gatekeeping was when we published The Dungeoneer, and we actually sent copy. We found a bunch of addresses of people who looked like they were involved in similar type of activities,
hmm
miniatures play, historical wargaming, etc. And we sent free copies of our magazine to pretty much every address we could find. I think we printed 100 copies or 200 copies, and we sent 100 free ones out. And I actually got a letter back from somebody who was very angry that I had sent this D&D crap to them. Now, this is 1975. So that was the first kind of experience that, maybe as a role-playing gamer, we weren't welcome at the general table of gaming. But later on, no, I didn't experience quite the same. What, how would I phrase it? my group was a mixed group. It was
Mm-hmm.
men and women, and that was the way up until that's the way we always played. It was a mix of um, players, guys and their girlfriends, um, guys and their wives. But the women were just as into the game as we were, the guys were.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no sense of imbalance of any kind. We
Yeah.
were all just players. We were all just players.
Right.
Um, but I kind of moved away. I went away from tabletop gaming for a number of years,
Mm-hmm.
simply because I was in video gaming. Um,
Right. Though video gaming is certainly not without its own issues with gatekeeping as well, which,
oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, we still say that, but we just saw Activision Blizzard get bought by Microsoft while they're in the midst
Oh
of just like endless scandals due to
yeah,
all kinds of inappropriate behavior, discrimination, and ultimately, just running a toxic culture there. And they're not unique in gaming.
no,
Many
no,
big studios have had that, and I mean, Gary Gygax very famously, published editorials in Dragon magazine talking about how he didn't think women were just as into or adept at gaming, and how there wasn't any kind of sexism that existed in that, and had said later on in life, even much later on in life, that he believed in biological determinism. And you
yeah.
unfortunately still see that reflected in the attitudes that some people cling to now.
Right,
And is that something? So that was not something that you ever were encountering much, at least early on. Then, which I think is great, because I know growing up, something that like gamers would make fun of furries, even though there was a lot of overlap there. I didn't know any better, and that was something that I know I learned from the culture. Was like, these are the people you can punch down on.
right, right.
Is that
And that
something?
was
Oh, go on. Sorry.
well, that was something growing up was the cultures you could punch down on. I grew up in the Midwest, and for me, I was very much more later in life aware of the racism that the whole area was steeped in. So that was just an awareness. But over time, I also saw that how it changed over time between my grandparents, my parents, myself, and then later my children. This more, to use a phrase, waking up, becoming sensitive to others, to other people. But growing up, we told a lot of Polish jokes.
Mm-hmm.
They were the culture we punched down at where I lived in Michigan. So yeah, there was that. I think part of the thing was is for the most part in the gaming group I was in, we were an island. We were isolated from pretty much everyone else. There weren't even other game groups that we were aware of in the county I lived in. So we were kind of unique in that regard. But even the conventions we went to, they were often spun science fiction clubs from colleges, and those were multi-gender and even mixed along other lines. So they were more open. I think in some ways they were much more open-minded in the 70s and early 80s about mixing, about equality, about things like that. The whole boys club, I think, didn't really start coming in until later, even as much as 20 years later.
Hmm.
Because, like I say, when I was at TSR in the early 90s, the design and editing group was almost evenly balanced between men and women, and women had a lot of the leadership roles in those groups. But going back then jumping over into video games and the advent of online gameplay, suddenly that all changed. That was for me. That was starting the scene of the actual boys' club in gaming,
Hmm.
and then that was right around the time that there was a resurgence in tabletop later on with the D20 rules, and what you were experiencing then was the grown-up boys from the 80s,
Yeah.
and them bringing back their fantasy, their memories of just playing with, the boys that they played with. Because I played
Right.
with adults. A lot of people from that time period, a lot of well, I'm going to say younger people who were younger than I am at that time. They played as kids, so they didn't have mixed game groups. They were
Right.
like
And,
they were like the kids in Stranger Things.
right. And it's something I hadn't really thought about, but how that, because there was definitely, I think, more of a focus put on the gentrification of things during the 80s because of the kind of like it was this macho era of false bravado, but that was definitely the I guess the zeitgeist of that time. And even though we still obviously had gender issues and sexism and gender
Mm-hmm.
roles during the 70s, it wasn't, society as a whole wasn't as, frankly, going in as much of an authoritarian direction at that time. That didn't happen until
Right.
later, and that's how we got Reagan in the first place.
Yep.
Um, and also I think it's probably a response to the Satanic Panic then too. That was a
Mm-hmm.
way to kind of like, oh well, this is a boys thing, of like shielding themselves a little bit more because they weren't trying to corrupt people's daughters. Uh,
Although
but
interesting, when you look at the Jack Chick tract
uh-huh.
from that time period, he focused on young girls
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
playing. That they were that it was an evil witch victimizing these young girls.
Right? Yeah, once her cleric got to level 7 or 9 or something, then it's like, oh, now you get to be inducted into the cult. It's like, oh, your character died, you have to commit ritual suicide.
Yep.
Yeah, I actually found one of those outside the game store I grew up at. Yeah, they stuck around for a while. So later on, like, I know that you moved throughout many different areas of gaming, not just TTRPGs, but that you've been more involved with speaking out about representation and even, working with some councils or giving presentations at cons about representation in gaming and specifically about, trans representation and LGBTQTIA representation in gaming. And is that
Mhm.
something that it was was that even on people's radar when you were first involved with the game? And is that something that you saw change in attitudes, much like you were talking about with kind of this gendered gatekeeping that started happening during your different points of contact with the TTRPG scene over the decades?
About the only thing I can remember, there wasn't really an issue. No one was talking about gender in games necessarily. There wasn't a try to create kind of an awareness, or we just weren't socially motivated
Hmm.
to try and fix things. And I look at one of the articles I wrote early on. Looking back on it, it's completely cringeworthy for about women in games, female characters in games, and I just cringe reading what I wrote then because it was sexist.
Yeah. Well, and to
But
be fair, it's not a journey if it doesn't have a beginning point.
right, somewhere around probably the late 80s, early 90s, I started to become aware that there were gay gamers out there. Not part of my life then, but it was just an awareness that it existed. When I wrote Central Casting, I really ran into issues about sexism. Initially, it was because there was a huge pushback against using generic he to refer to player
Hmm.
characters. So, okay, I accepted that should be changed. So the next time around, I alternated pronouns. The next book, I alternated pronouns
Hmm.
between male and female pronouns. And I got called out because some people decided that I had actually chosen and carefully curated or selected which entries would have a male pronoun or which would have a female pronoun. And all I did was just pick a starting point on each section
Right.
and then alternate. So that kind of I actually, as a writer, I found that annoying back then. There were other issues with those books, but they were more about my perspectives on just about everything as seen from the point of view of someone trying to fit into a religious community.
Hmm. It's interesting how many people bring that to their experience with role playing games,
Mm-hmm.
and end up using that, exploring that in some way through their gaming, whether it's in what they are like producing for the game, like the adventures they run or write, or just in the what they explore with their characters. I know
Mm-hmm.
for me, throughout my life, it was a way to explore, like try on a number of different roles or hats or identities to find out more about myself. And it wasn't something I was always aware of at first. Is that something that you had a growing awareness of during, like, with all the different gaming that you were doing? I know you weren't always playing D&D, but was that something that you were conscious of, or that was there a moment where you realized, huh, I keep doing this, or I keep playing characters like this, and why is that?
Well, I didn't actually. It's because I was a GM so often. I didn't play as many characters as other people might have, and then
Hmm.
I literally kind of walked away from role playing games around the late '80s. Even though I was writing them at the time,
Hmm.
I didn't have a group to play with anymore,
Right?
um,
It,
and,
it
and I
happens.
had and I had kids, and that just when you're working 60 hours a week to try and make ends meet and being a parent the rest of the time, you don't have
Right.
time for gaming.
Exactly.
So, but one of the things I was aware of was I was suppressing part of myself for most of my adult life. And one of that was being very much aware that I wanted, the feminine side, my feminine nature. I was trying to suppress that, so I just never played female characters because I was terrified that I would do it too well,
Hmm.
or that someone would see something that I wasn't seeing in my own performance, and would draw conclusions that I didn't want drawn because back in the '70s and '80s and '90s, it was not okay to be transgender.
Right. There really wasn't a space that was created for that. I know
Hmm.
my first real awareness of that in the gaming scene was through the World of Darkness games, and I had a lot of friends
Hmm.
that got into that in the '90s, and that was where I really started. I mean, that and the fact that my mom knew lots of theater people, I all of my concepts of gender and sexuality and sexual and and gender identity and stuff started to be broken down, and as I was exposed to this. But it was something that yeah, I had just took for granted. But there wasn't that space there. That same grizzled old Marine GM who taught me how to play D&D, really, the reason why I left his game was because he had, like, that GM I discovered was, very homophobic. And then that very next session, he had an NPC that was just like every bad stereotype: the lisp, the limp wrist,
Oh.
just like
Hmm.
the constant, like, awkward flirting and stuff. And it was so upsetting. And and it was upsetting too to see that brought into the game. And I mean, it still gets me upset thinking about it now because I love that game and I love the relationship that I had with that GM. And by doing that, it just instantly tainted everything. It was impossible for me to look at, like, I was always aware of, like, what is he really trying to say now? Like, is he trying to get this across? And that was my first encounter with that kind of, like, real kind of, well, bigotry, to be honest, but like gatekeeping in that gaming community, and then discovering from there just how common that was, unfortunately.
Yeah. One of the interesting things when it's not always true, but when you encounter someone who is virulently homophobic or virulently transphobic, it's often because they're self-suppressing.
Mm-hmm.
There is something in their own life that they don't want to let out, and by attacking that part, that they feel they might be helping to helping to suppress it in themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's unfortunate how often you run into that, because even the slightest hint of exploring that is something that they become afraid of.
Hmm.
But what do you think about where gaming has been going now, as far as inclusivity of people, regardless of gender identity or sexuality or ethnic background or any of that stuff, and the move to, I guess, address when gaming has fallen short in these regards in the past?
I am supportive of it. I mean, just in my own small way, just in my own writings, just changing the change from using pronouns, gendered pronouns, to they singular when I'm writing in my book. I mean, I have a hard time writing he or she now for people's
Hmm.
pronouns because of that. It's just natural for me now to shift over to using they. I think it is a direction we need to go. One of the issues that has plagued tabletop gaming for a very long time is that it is perceived as being a white male pastime.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is because some of that is because people who didn't fit that stereotype weren't comfortable inserting themselves into other people's gaming. Where they were the only person who looked like themselves in the room.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of, the more we make our games look like the way the world looks, we're making a step in the right direction. Not every hero is white. Not every villain is necessarily going. If you need to be comfortable making your villains and your heroes anything.
Right.
Not assuming that, well, just because, not assuming that certain types of behavior, whether it's sexual or etc., are limited to a villain or a hero or an NPC.
Hmm. Though it's interesting because there can be like tricky areas I can get into. I remember, oh god, I think it was 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, but there was a Kickstarter project for a 5e D&D monster manual that was all queer coded villains. Now, it was from a like publisher that had been doing a whole kind of queer coded adaptation of 5e D&D, so it was clearly done in good faith and coming from
Hmm.
the right people, but at the same time, like taken on its own, you could see how that would be problematic too.
Yes.
Because you're like, here's a whole book where all the bad guys are queer.
Yeah, that's taken out of context. That's going to be a problem.
Right. It's certainly like it's interesting, though. I mean, at the same time, like one of my favorite games to come out in the past couple of years is Thirsty Sword Lesbians from Evil Hat Productions,
Hmm.
Fred Hicks. Eh, Just a brilliant game that is like very openly like saying like this is for queer folks and for allies, and there's no bigotry in here, and this is meant to tell queer stories, and and for people who enjoy queer stories regardless of who you are, and it does a
Hmm.
really good job doing that. But it's also just incredible, I think, to see that we can have games like that coming out and existing at the same time that we've got the third iteration of TSR trying to like make its resurgence as well. And as much as they're mostly just a PR nightmare right now, the fact is that they still have supporters in the gaming community, that they are showing us that those people are still there.
Hmm.
So what do you, I guess, What I'm trying to get at is, what do you think are areas where gaming could still take more steps, or what do you think some of those steps would be that could open it up even more or make it even more welcoming?
Continue to include visual representations of diversity in art, and including visual representation of women, of respectful images of women.
Hmm.
Uh, we came out of we came out of the Frazetta era where we saw heroes who were big food men, and they were always protecting buxom, recumbent women.
Hmm.
You know, no, women, and even when women were the heroes, they were wearing they were wearing armor that no sensible fighter would ever wear.
Right. Much as I love my
So
old Conan covers, like, yeah, not.
yes, yes, yeah, that's where I'm going. Conan, Red Sonja.
Hmm.
In fact, my favorite Red Sonja cover was, I think it was issue number 24 of Conan, the Conan comic book, which was done by Barry Windsor Smith. And she and Conan are fighting in a bar scene, and she's wearing a full chainmail top.
Huh.
So,
That's
yeah.
unusual.
Yeah.
I mean, given everyone's wearing a loincloth in most of the Conan art, but
Right.
yeah, there's certainly I mean, it's the male power fantasy, even if
Right.
the guy is mostly naked too. And I think that makes such a huge difference. That was something that I know there was like a conscious effort in that with third edition D&D, and I loved about Pathfinder because they really went all out with that and continue to like push that.
Mhm.
But even like in my work with some publishers now, some third party D&D publishers, I find that something that is easily forgotten is the impact that art and art selection has on that overall experience and how people interpret a game. And that's how you got your start with submit was it or I thought you got your start with submitting illustrations and submitting art,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
I sent literally filler sketches to metagaming concepts. That's how I got started in gaming.
wow. Yeah, with the self-addressed envelope with the prepaid return envelope inside, right?
I don't even know if I did that.
Oh wow.
They had an open request for art, and I just started sending sketches, little really simple doodles, and they started printing them and said, "Please send more." And that's how I paid for my first D&D books.
Hey, that's how a lot of people got into this. I know, like Owen Casey Stevens, he talked about how submitting his first thing to Dragon was kind of a Hail Mary, and it was just like he was so happy he was able to use it to pay for his D&D books. So I'm curious what, with like the art, when you were in charge of the art direction, or I'm sorry, or the art selection at TSR for a while, weren't you?
Very briefly, about 6 months.
Was that an
Um,
awareness that they had back then?
um, they how to phrase this? There was an awareness, but an active decision not to pursue it.
Yeah, I remember hearing the story about Clyde Caldwell making Margaret Weiss cry because he didn't want to put pants on Goldmoon. Yeah.
And there was another issue where Roger Moore had shifted over to working in design from the Dragon, and he made a comment about we should do about wanting to do a D&D cover where you had a black female warrior wearing a dashiki, and that just totally made TSR's management completely uncomfortable.
Wow. Huh. I mean, considering some of the stuff they put out, like Isle of the Ape and all that. Well, I guess it's interesting where they like drew that line. I know, like Ed Greenwood talked about how they edited out stuff like that, like mentioning people of color or some of the same-sex relationships that were in the original like documents he handed over for the Forgotten Realms. Not all of them, though. I remember I went through the original book, and I found or the original box set, and I found or no, it was Waterdeep in the North, but I found the mention of a pair of married queens that they had managed to not edit out. Ed was very proud about that. So talking like when we're talking about looking back at these old products like the Savage Frontier, for instance, and looking at some of the tropes that get represented there, what are your feelings about how we should approach or treat these things? For instance, like I love the Savage Frontier, and it is one of the seminal Forgotten Realms products. But there are certainly some representations in there, such as of the Aleutians, the Inuit coded culture that is in that book, that would be viewed as problematic these days. So I guess so. What's your view on how we should approach older works like these, and do we throw the baby out with the bathwater?
You can probably change the bathwater. There's nothing that says that a product can't be woken up a bit by changing some of the content.
Mm-hmm.
I don't specifically remember that culture. My remembrance is more of like the Uthgardt barbarians, who were just basically generic barbarians who came from the north.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have specific memories of the other barbarian culture.
Oh,
So the other cultures.
yeah, but I guess as a writer, as a creator, that's something that you don't take it personally if people go back to your work and say, "Hey, like this was problematic, or this wasn't a great representation," and decided to change it. Because I know
If
some.
someone explains themselves that way, yeah, I have no problem with that.
Oh, because I've found that is something that can be like a very sensitive topic. And even just acknowledging that those mistakes were made. I know, like, talking with I'm friends with a number of folks that wrote for the Forgotten Realms. I'm not going to throw a bunch of names out here because I'm throwing a little shade, but I remember things got a little heated once when I brought up, was like, well, look, regardless of how deeply all the lore was written, the fact is that everyone in the impression everyone had was that everyone in the Forgotten Realms is white. That's who we saw on the covers of all the products.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand, like, this was not something they were conscious of or aware of, and didn't have a lot of control over while they were there either. But at the same time, there's a defensiveness that kicks in, wanting to say, taking that personally and not being able to separate the author from the work, I guess. And is that something that you found has been like, is that gotten easier for you as you've gotten older and you look back on some of your earlier works and like can see things that were cringe?
Oh yeah, I totally can. I was referring. I mentioned that article was in the Dungeoneer about
Mm-hmm.
living in D&D, and that is totally cringe. I want to go back and rescue at least some aspects of that, but I want to gender neutralize it um, when I bring it forward.
And
Um,
I'm assuming for the new edition of Casting Call, it's been all they
or
thems. Or
central
Central Casting.
casting.
I'm sorry.
Oh gosh yes. It's I mean, I've even made word choices so that I don't use the word barbarian
Mm.
because it's a loaded word. Other choices, to try and neutralize the language to get rid of problematic words.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
I
mean,
mean, even I had a discussion on one of my pages about, well, what do you think of me using these names? And I think ended up getting rid of primitive
mm.
and barbarian and replacing them with primeval and untamed.
Ooh, really good word choices. And yeah, that's something I struggle with a lot. Even just when I'm running games just for my friends, it's still something I try to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of now, especially because I love to take old content and introduce it to people who are newer to D&D who didn't get that chance to, go through the Dark Tower or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I have not updated Dark Tower yet, though I do have my Judges Guild, like my old copy, sitting here waiting for that. But yeah, like it's those word choices can be so important, and I guess that continues to illustrate how so many of the small things in like elements in a game can dramatically change the experience that people are having with it.
Mhm.
Uh, so we've spent a lot of time talking about like I mean your long history with this and all the different ways that you've learned to like approach this. So I'm curious, what are there some go-to tools, some tips, or just habits that you have as a GM, and then when on the rare occasions as a player that you use to try and make sure that you're getting the experience out of a game session that you want to?
Um, as far as a GM, it goes back to something we learned at I learned at Ensemble Studios and working on Age of Empires products is that the what makes a game fun is giving players meaningful choices to make. And that's kind of how I approach design. You know, my design approach is to give players the opportunity in most situations to actually make meaningful choices that can be more than just fight or fight or flee. So that's one thing I'm mostly doing as a designer. I want to give character. I'm work. I want to create characters that want players to create characters that have a sense of life to them. That they're
Mm,
not just stats. I want people playing to be playing characters, not just playing stats.
right. It's kind of like the difference between running an avatar and playing a character.
Right. I think one of the most fun characters we had way back in the day was one of my friends rolled a character that was 18 strength, double zero. He may have cheated that, and 3 intelligence. So
Oh man.
he became Mongo the Mighty, and he played him like the character from Blazing Saddles. You know, he was a
Oh,
fighter, but it created a fun experience for everyone at the table to have this flawed character.
hmm. And of course, you'd have to really like lean into it and sell it. But yeah, I think that that kind of three dimensionality in characters and wanting that is so key. Because
Um,
that's what elevates, I think, RPGs or any. I think that elevates any game, but I think RPGs are best able to be elevated in that way. You have the most opportunity for that. It's a lot harder in, I think, a video game to create that experience. Though you know that a lot better than me. Has that been your experience?
well, most of my work in video games has been either first person shooters or real time strategy games.
Hmm.
And for me, the first person shooters just to make the place feel like a place. The maze you're running around in
Yeah.
feel like a place that it had purpose at some point, that it had interesting architecture, that it had a sense of place to it. That for me that helped make the game, and I could see that in doing. I guess for the time I briefly worked on an MMO, on the Vampire MMO, that was that sense too, that we were creating settings
Hmm.
that really conveyed a sense of place to them, both by what was going on there and the way the buildings were constructed, etc.
Like literally setting the stage.
Right, you're setting the stage for rich or for getting players involved.
Hmm. And
Even
that's,
with like working on Age of Empires or Age of Empires 3 when I was building scenes, some of the home cities for the characters. I wanted to get people to have a sense that this was a place, that things were happening here,
hmm,
and the way you dressed out the set. And did the same thing with Halo Wars when building the game, the player maps, multiplayer maps, because that was what my job was
hmm.
beautifying those maps, was to make them feel like places, which was sometimes a challenge because I'd get the map from the designer and it was just It was literally a blank space with playing links in it. You'd ask them, "Well, where is this place?" And they kind of look at you and say, "I don't know."
Oh man.
My job then was to make it feel like, um, the ruined exterior of a Forerunner Shield world,
And I can say you did a very good job of
someplace
that.
like in the original Halo game where you were in a lush outdoor environment.
hmm
And if you saw parts of the map, there was you could almost sense a story had happened there, even though you were running around building buildings and shooting the aliens.
Yeah, it came through because playing Halo Wars, that was one of the things that really stood out to me about that game was how it gave me a sense for the world of Halo that you
Hmm.
really hadn't like you got tastes of it in Halo 2 and 3 with what you saw of Earth and stuff, but you really got very little. And it wasn't until I mean, I know you weren't involved, but Reach was a Halo game that really stood out to me with the way that they
Hmm.
more than any of their like FPS games have done before, they put in that story element through how you just interacted with the environment and how what you saw in the world around you, the little tidbits that you got, because there was never that opportunity other than the few cutscenes to kind of tell you this stuff.
Hmm.
And I think it makes it so much more impactful when players are having or the player, the audience is having to experience what is happening to them rather than being told what is happening to them.
Right. Now, another thing. This is going back to tabletop, and it's a different approach. Is that when I was running a campaign game, one of the things I tried to do was when characters created backstories for themselves, I would build part of the world to enable their backstory.
Mm.
That things would happen in the game that were to that character or to the group because of that backstory information they gave me. So I would spend time, after away from the game, writing up things that the characters were interacting with their own story. And I wish I could have, carried that on longer, but then my group started breaking up just because we all
Mhm.
got laid off from Coleco, and
Well, that'll do it. Yeah.
people started moving away.
Yeah, exactly. People gotta make ends meet and have families to support, and that's unfortunately an all too common story with many gaming groups. And it's something that I think gaming still struggles to find that way to connect that kind of personal feel, characters' backstories with what's coming out through what's going on in like the adventure or in the system as a whole. It always does get down to the gym and the players being able to collaborate. I don't think anyone's been able to find a mechanical solution for that. I
Hmm.
like I know with the 5e campaigns they've been releasing, one of the biggest issues they've had is how hard it is for like it feels like they're just whoever the players are, it's just whoever happened to show up, it doesn't really matter. And so you don't feel special. I think they've done a better job of that with their more recent adventures, but it's been interesting to see how even this late into role playing's existence that it's still something that we're kind of struggling to find like how do we make the story connect to the people in it and how do we get them to connect to their characters better that way. That has been something you've had a lot of insight into in all the different roles you've played throughout the different mediums in the gaming industry that you've participated in, whether it's through how people are seeing it, through art, through the design of the levels, and also through miniatures as well, because you've been painting a lot of minis lately, right?
That's my hobby now.
Was it always your
It's it.
hobby?
No, well, it was my hobby when in the late '70s and when I was just getting started in games because I wanted to have nice looking miniatures to play with. And then when I was working at Coleco, I wasn't doing a lot of creative work anymore because I was in management.
hmm
So I shifted. That became my creative outlet, was painting the miniatures. And then when kids came along and a lot of other things, there just wasn't time to play it. So I came back to it about 4 years ago when a friend or I should say, he's now a friend, but at the time, someone reached out to me about working with him on his Kickstarter, one of his Kickstarters, and that kind of got me interested in backing his Kickstarter and then collecting more miniatures. And then I found that because the Seattle climate was such that in the winter it was really dark in the morning,
Hmm.
I needed to start sitting in front of a sun lamp. So I would spend like an hour in the morning sitting in front of a full spectrum light lamp. What can I do? What's a great thing to do while you're just sitting there?
Oh
I sat
man,
and painted.
that is brilliant. Like, oh, that is brilliant. Like, that's something like I'm gonna have to. I don't paint as much anymore, though. I've been going through a bunch of terrain that I'm getting painted up right now.
Hmm.
I backed way too many terrain Kickstarters during the pandemic,
Oh,
and
yeah.
but my wife is a professional minis painter, and so we have the past few bones sitting around our house right now, and that sun
Yeah, me
lamp
too.
idea is so great. And it's something that's so do you actually use your minis in your games these days, or
I
are they
haven't.
most time
I
sit on the shelves?
They sit on shelves right now because I haven't run games in a long time. Hopefully, going to change that later this spring. One of my gifts from my wife has been a gaming table for our. We have a room in the house
Ooh.
that is going to be the game room. It was always designated when we moved here to be the game room, and now I'm going to have this custom game table in there. And with hopefully COVID eventually dying down, we can actually have people over and game again.
Well, that's great. So that actually that gets to something that I'd really wanted to ask about as well. What has been the role that gaming has played with between your relationship with your wife Rebecca?
We don't game a lot together. We have different interests that way. Like this is going to sound weird. The one game we do play together occasionally is on Roblox. It's called Bee Swarm Simulator,
Huh.
and it's just a grindy, maybe kind of an MMO. And sometimes you need to get other player interaction, but it's that's about the only gaming we do together. Because most of the time she right now she's in the other room. I think she's working on writing scripts for the comic strip for the comic book she has online, and I'm in here talking with you. And
Mhm.
otherwise, I would be either focusing on my next work project or finishing the miniatures I have on the other side of the monitors.
Well, and I find my wife and I in similar situations a lot. Like I'm playing a game or working on something or mastering an audio podcast now while she's at the desk, like literally behind me, working on a bust or prepping a bunch of minis
Hmm.
or something like that. Though she is in the games that I run, not all of them, but try to have her in a lot of those, and that's been great part of for our relationship. Does now my wife has always been better at most video games than me, I have to admit,
Hmm.
especially FPSs. Now, your wife is a national video game champion.
Yes, she
Does
is.
she get competitive?
Yeah, she's still competitive that way. Most of the games she likes to play just to distract herself are either idle type games where you just sit and click on things,
Hmm.
or skill based abstract shooters.
Mm.
Kind of Geometry Wars would be
Ah, yeah.
something, where it's just frenzied action, and she just focuses on it until she's gotten that energy worked out.
Hmm. My wife very much the same. Like I want to sit down and play, a long form RPG like Mass Effect or Fallout or something like that, and she wants to do some multiplayer, Warcraft 3 or something like that. Man, Warcraft 3, I dated myself there. That's not what the kids are playing these days. It's I don't know, HOTS. So Did Rebecca have a history with role-playing games before you got together? Had she ever played any of your past adventures, for instance?
Oh yeah, she knew who I was long before we actually got together. She had been a D&D player back when she was younger. So she was familiar with me. I'm certain she may have played in some of my stuff. I don't know that, but like I said, I'm probably once we get everything back together, I'm hoping to once things calm down, I'm actually hoping to run face to face tabletop with her again. And I've let her know I want her at the table.
Oh, man, that's going to be so great. It's definitely, I have found it to be a very rewarding experience, and my wife ran a short campaign for us for a while too, and then it was just so much fun. Though there's nothing quite like when you get to actually play together, like
Mm-hmm.
both as players. I don't know, have you guys had that opportunity? I know you said you really haven't been, during the like
We
time of your
have
relationship.
we've had a couple.
Oh,
We've done it once or twice.
oh, cool. So when you run, what are you gonna run? What have you been like? Is there something? Have you already chosen a game system, or is there a list? I'm curious.
As far as games, I'm probably going to go back to Swords and Wizardry.
Mm-hmm.
It's original D&D. It's simple. It can be Wahoo if needed be. Rules can be more interpretive than legalistic, I guess. And I've been writing some stuff for 5e, and I'm not intrigued by the complexity of it.
Mm.
I guess that's the best way to kind of go. It's not a system I would choose to play.
You've have you had a tendency toward more complex systems or less complex systems?
I'm gonna say less complex. My go-to for a while was RuneQuest, and this is back in the late '70s and early
Mm-hmm.
'80s, and we were playing AD&D at the other games we were playing, and I ended up kind of when I came back to gaming, I tried getting back into RuneQuest, and I realized why I had walked away from RuneQuest. It was just the complexity of setting things up, of characters up.
Yeah. It.
That just a simple monster had to be as complex as a character.
Mm-hmm. It.
And then, as you ramped up in difficulty, player competence, which meant higher difficulty, it became more difficult to balance
Mm-hmm.
to the point that yeah, this just isn't the kind of it doesn't have a feeling like it did back in the old days.
Yeah. It's interesting looking back on some of those systems that had more rules crunch to them, which was
Yep.
definitely the norm at a certain period in time for gaming, and how like great and fantastic is like, man, you've got detail for everything now, but you realize in practice, I think, how much of that like gets discarded or left by the wayside. Like I know that
Hmm.
with I was playing in a third edition group for a long time during the pandemic, so recently, and this was with a bunch of former TSR writers, including guys who had published for third edition. And something that was very surprising to me was how much of the rule set most of them were just ignoring or forgetting about or just hand waving because it wasn't worth it to spend the time going into
Hmm.
the extensive detail unless you were a rules lawyer like me who was going to whip out the weapon type versus armor type chart to try and weasel out of getting hit by a bugbear with a morning star.
Oh
uh,
goodness.
so you've moved away from crunch now. Some people would argue that there was still like a lot of math and a lot of crunch in the older, like the kind of the BX versions of the game. And my understanding is like Swords and Sorcery is closer to those earlier editions of D&D than it is to say like fifth edition or certainly like 3, correct?
Swords and Wizardry
Swords and
is
Wizardry. I'm
essentially
sorry.
Swords and Wizardry is essentially white box D&D with Greyhawk added in.
Oh,
That's
okay.
that it goes back before BX. And I actually never played. I did some designing in the BX system, but I never played in it.
Okay.
Um,
And so, do you find that when you're thinking about designing for this, does it free you up a lot more? Not essentially not having to be constrained with figuring out just all the specifics, the rules, I should say, the crunch for
Yes,
all
it
these
does.
things.
It does free me up. Although one of the things I discovered in one of my some of the design puzzle or the play puzzles I set up is I wasn't thinking about all the options, all the ways that players could overcome them. Because this was like the last time I ran a game was at GaryCon 2 years ago, and two, maybe longer, three. And the players, I had a certain particular, not a trap so much as a barricade, and they just said, "Here, we'll just cast this spell, and we'll just walk around." And that's not what I had intended.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I had that happen a few sessions ago. I ambushed my group with some summoned elementals and forgot that the one of the players had just gotten banishment. And so
There you go.
just like boom, they're gone. And then there was one guy left and they just beat him down. And but you gotta, at least for me, I found sometimes you just gotta let the players have that win. So
Yep.
what game?
And I,
Oh, go
oh,
on.
sorry. And I tend to create a world where the players don't have access to all the magics available in the world. So there's some mystery to magic, especially anything that's ancient.
Mm,
That maybe once upon a time magic was more potent.
yeah, that's certainly something they've tried to do with fifth edition to come
Hmm.
back from where it was in 3E, where every magic item was specced out and priced to the copper piece, so there was no mystery or
Yeah.
magic to it anymore. Though they still, it seems like they overcorrected a bit with this. But D&D aside, are there other game systems that have been on your radar that you've wanted to try, whether like recent ones, or is there a game that you loved from like the 80s or 90s that you would love to see rediscovered or try again?
Not necessarily role playing. I'm more interested in, say, getting into some of the more modern board games
Hmm.
that have RPG elements. Hero Quest. I backed the recent Hero Quest
Ooh, yeah.
from Hasbro, and I've got the game. I remember playing it with my kids, and I want to play that again. Or I've got some of the Zombicide games
Mm-hmm.
that look like they would be fun. I want to play. One of the games I want to get into is trying out Frosthaven.
Oh, yeah. That's
You know,
I mean, that's like a baby RPG right there.
yeah, it is, but it's more about tactical
Mm-hmm.
tactical play with miniatures.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
So
a
I've already started collecting. You know, it's going to be a while before I can play, so I'm already starting to collect miniatures that could make a I can't remember the word they're using for it, but basically your unit, your team of
Oh,
players.
yeah, yeah.
You
That's
know, who would make a good mage, who would make a good apothecary.
mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife and I have Gloomhaven, and that's something that we started playing through. And then just recently, the new Descent released from Fantasy Flight Games that has
Hmm.
the like app component. Beautiful miniatures that came with that, and really, really love the game dynamic that they use for that. The way that they have you set up levels and go through it, it really makes it feel. It felt like playing through a good Neverwinter Nights module, like a
Okay.
yeah, like it was right at that cusp of like, are we playing an actual RPG? This is almost feeling like it. It's not quite there, but yeah, really, really well put together game. And we had all the past editions of Descent, and so we're like, oh, do we want to buy the new one? And it was just amazing.
Yeah, I think I've got one version of it on one Descent game on my shelves. Probably purchased for the miniatures.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful minis, and I reuse them in all my D&D games, of course, because
Yep.
So, with all that you've been involved with and produced in the gaming scene, whether video games or TTRPGs, what do you think your legacy in the industry is going to be?
Legacy in the industry is probably going to be Dark Tower and Caverns of Thracia on the tabletop role playing side, particularly since Goodman Games recently purchased Dark Tower from
Mm-hmm.
Judges Guild and are in the process of reissuing it as a new updated game event edition.
Yeah.
So those are the two things that people are really going to remember me from the D&D side. If you played RuneQuest, you're going to remember my contribution of Griffin Mountain.
Hmm.
That thing I call the adventure, the setting, one of the first campaign
Right.
settings ever for any game that I collaborated with Rudy Kraft and Greg Stafford on. And then, of course, also I will be forever linked to ducks
That would.
Because of Duck Tower.
Hmm. And then wait, wasn't there a Quack Keep too, like a follow up or something?
That was recent. It was Darcy Perry, who is the owner and sculptor for Star Hat Miniatures in New Zealand. I backed one of his Kickstarter because he had some ducks in it. I thought they were fun sculpts, and we ended up collaborating on his next Kickstarter, which became Quack Pete, which was nearly all duck models for not necessarily for RuneQuest, but just a lot of them were just visual puns. I mean, there
Hmm.
was the Ductor, who was a take on the Doctor Who, the Fifth Doctor,
Hmm.
takes on a lot of popular culture characters. And there's even two of the ducks in the set. One is a representation of me, and another was a representation of Darcy himself. So and it's just a generic campaign setting set in pretty much any world you want it to be, as long as there are ducks.
Oh man, gives me like Tales from the Floating Vagabond vibes, which multi-dimensional wacky bar that could show up in any game setting for those who don't remember it from the 90s. So that's what you think your legacy will be in
Well,
gaming.
that's on the tabletop side.
Yeah.
Um, you flip over to the other side. I'm going to be forever remembered for Quake
Mhm.
2, Quake 3, and then although it's not much of a remembrance necessarily, it's one of my greatest contributions to video gaming was the creation of the Guild Hall at SMU, or SMU Guild Hall, which was a graduate studies program to learn how to make games for
Oh
video games.
wow. See,
I was
that's fantastic. I say like, and that actually gets to. I had a follow up question. What do you hope you would be remembered for? And that seems to speak more to that.
yeah, and I'm hoping to be remembered just that overall contribution to games over the years. Because I'm involved in talking with people about ColecoVision because that was my life for 4 years. I'm still involved in writing game adventures, and I've got central casting. It's kind of backburnered right now just because I'm doing red pen edits, and they just
Hmm.
take forever.
Yeah.
And I wrote too much, so it takes even forever squared.
Yeah. Killing your darlings is always difficult.
Oh, I'm not. The problem is I'm not killing them. I'm
Oh.
just correct. I'm correcting them.
My mom's a writer and editor, so I watched her do that many, many times, and also grew up with her doing that over my shoulder anytime I was writing anything for school. It was always just
Yep.
like the instant correction or editor's note, and
You don't want to say that. No, you should use those words.
oh man, I'm getting triggered just hearing that.
Sorry.
No, it totally fine, and I love my mom's advice because she's always encouraged me to write and create, and said how
Hmm.
great I was, even as she was telling me how to do it better. But I think that you definitely have made a big impact in gaming because I mean, Jaquaying the dungeon is a term that has been trending now, and even in this modern edition of D&D that you haven't been involved with for a long time, for decades at this point, the principles that people gleaned just from looking at your work that they learned from that
Hmm.
is something that is still influencing like game design now. Like I know Sly Flourish, the lazy dungeon master. You
Hmm.
know, he's been talking about your stuff a lot more and more recently. You see that incorporated into his philosophy of, and it's not even lazy DMing. I see it more as getting the most out of the least effort. You know, getting the most impact out of the smallest amount of effort, or the smallest, I guess, lightest touch. And that seems to be very in line with what you consistently did with trying to create this story, create this narrative out of very few elements and literally a limited amount of space, whether it was the size of the level that you were designing or the page count for the adventure and the page size of a dungeon map.
Hmm.
Is that something that do you think that characterizes your, I guess, your perspective on gaming more than, I guess, a list of principles, but just doing the most with, I guess, the tools that you have?
Yeah, a lot of it is just approaching game development from a desire to give players a variety of experiences. And that carried from my dungeon design through my video game design and video game art. Just and I still look at it. It's meaningful choices and variety of experience.
I mean, honestly, I think that's what PCs aside, I think that's what most of us really desire, to some
Hmm.
degree, out of life, is meaningful choices and a variety of experiences. So,
So
yeah. Wow. So before, there's one last question I have for you.
okay.
What is one question you wish I'd asked you, and how would you have answered?
Hmm. Well, for this type of interview, I'd say, "What are you doing now?"
Oh, absolutely. I was going to have a whole list of that in the outro, but yeah, what are you doing now? Tell us about it, Jennell.
Well, I've just started on a project that is probably going to take me several months that I can't talk about. As we say, an NDA thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've got my central casting books that I am just grinding through that I hope to be able to get into layout later this year, and maybe figure out how I'm going to pay for a 800-page 3-volume publication. So that's side. I've got a 5e adventure that's been kind of mothballed for a while that I need to go back to and finish my edits on. I had people blind test it for me because I've never run 5e games, and we just need to work their edits back into the adventure and then get it ready to publish. So that's tabletop video games. I'm still working with the video game company I founded about 9 years ago called
Old
Old
school?
School. Yep.
Yeah, the
Um,
you guys last thing I saw was the Descent 3 like release on the Steam. That was relatively, that was a
oh,
month ago, right?
that was a
That was a long
long
time
time
ago.
ago. That was a long time ago. We are getting ready to ship later this year a collector's edition of a game by Seth. He goes by 8-bit. He's a chiptune musician, 8-bit weapon,
Okay.
and he has done a video game for the Apple II that is similar to Bard's Tale 3 in playstyle and appearance, but is set in the American West in the late 18 or in the early 1800s.
Oh wow. That sounds really interesting. Um,
And he's going through. He did all the work on the design end of it. He had another programmer he's working with do the programming, and my involvement has been doing the packaging and content for the collectible box. So I'm basically doing marketing artwork for that, marketing artwork and editing and page production, the whole thing.
well, that is
Um,
so key, as well, you certainly know with anything, like you can have a great product, but if the marketing doesn't hold it up, no one's going to hear about it.
yep. So that's and then whenever I can't focus on anything, I move around the table, turn my lights on, and challenge myself with painting game miniatures for the table.
Hey, painting is a great way to relax, unless
Yep.
you're constantly looking over your shoulder and seeing your wife painting some jaw-dropping miniature.
No, my wife doesn't. My wife doesn't paint, and I don't program. But we have a very clear division of
Delineation,
labor
yeah.
here. Yeah.
Certain lines
She,
just
she
aren't crossed.
yeah. But we both wish we had the other skills. But
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I am always impressed and amazed by my wife and her talents. I think that's just a general statement for most people who have a spouse. So,
yeah, I
uh,
say my only wish in that regard is that I still had the eyesight and stability of hands that I had 30 years ago.
mm, yeah, man,
So,
I'm wishing that I had the eyesight and just the lack of creaky joints that I did just 5 or 10 years ago. At this point.
well, it doesn't get any better. So, yeah.
Okay, well, that is quite a bit of current projects. Make sure to check down below where I will have Future Spike will have put links that lead to any of these things that I can. But I really appreciate you spending the time with me, Jennell, and this has been really insightful, and you've given me and everyone else a lot to think over. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, you're quite welcome.
Thank you for listening, folks. I would like to thank writer, artist, and game designer Jennell Jaquays for being our guest on this episode of RPG Obsession, the show where passion meets inspiration. You can find Jennell's past RPG work on Amazon, DriveThruRPG, DM's Guild, and many publishers' websites, and her video game work everywhere that you can find great games, past and present. You can look for future releases coming from her through Dragon Girl Studios and Old School, and you can find the latest updates on what she's working on both her Facebook and Twitter accounts. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time, and remember, own your experience.